our need to protect our reputation is one of the strongest things in us, one of the strongest reactions in us. And one of the greatest tests of faith is cultivating the ability to not do that. It is remarkable how in each episode we're going to see God is sovereignly preparing Elijah for what he will face next. So in this episode, he's blamed for the death of someone that he's not responsible for their death. In the next episode, what's going to happen is Elijah is going to go and confront Ahab, and Ahab is going to say to Elijah, "You troubler of Israel." In other words, Elijah is going to put on Ahab is going to put onto Elijah the blame for what's happening in Israel. The drought, the famine. So here he's blamed falsely for the loss of one life. In the next episode, he's going to be blamed falsely for the loss of untold numbers of lives, in addition to untold amounts of suffering. Is it easy to be falsely blamed? It's hard. It is hard to receive blame for what we know is not blame that's ours. That's not an easy thing to face. Elijah needed to be prepared for that. And so God has prepared him at the brook. He's prepared him in the widow's home, and now he's prepared him by letting him be falsely blamed for the death of the young boy, of which he was not responsible. Now he will be ready, so to speak, in the next episode to be blamed for even more. Now we see, what have you to do with me? What have you against me, O man of God? She sees this personal sort of vendetta that Elijah has against her. Notice the irrationality of that. What have you to do against me? As though Elijah is against her and he just wanted to bring about this death of her son. Elijah was sustaining her. Elijah was helping her. Remember how we talked about she was Elijah's provider, but Elijah was her provider, and how God provides through the needs of others and everything? There was no animosity in Elijah's heart. There was nothing but care and concern. But yet, in her irrationality, oftentimes we're irrational in times like this, right? So we're careful here. We're not going to be too, condescending to the widow. Because what she has experienced is a tragedy beyond words. And we know in those times things will be said that maybe we don't mean. I think we'll see a little bit later in the passage that I don't think she really meant that. But this irrational sort of thing, you were against me, Elijah. You wanted this to happen. You brought this about when nothing of the sort was true. What have you against me? You have come to me, and notice this, to bring my sin to remembrance. Do you know that the guilt of unrepented and unforgiven sin remains with lost people their entire life? We can be good at suppressing that and pressing that down and forgetting about it. The widow has put it aside. In her life here in Zarephath, surrounded by all kinds of other things, she's sort of put that out of mind and out of heart. But it's still there. The conscience is still there. She still knows that she is guilty of sin against the one who brought this death of her son. She knows in her heart that there is unforgiven sin. And so she says to Elijah, have you come to bring this to remembrance? She instinctively knows not only that the Creator is the one whose hand has allowed this or brought this about, however you want to phrase that, has brought this about, and that same Creator is the one that she has sinned against, and her sin is yet unforgiven. You know, we can press those thoughts down, we can push that out of our life, but there's one thing that will always bring that right back up to the surface, and that's tragedy. Outside of Jesus Christ, when we are living with unforgiven sin, when we're living with the guilt of our separation between us and our Creator God, we can suppress that out of our minds and out of our thoughts, and we can have a good time. But there is one certain sure thing that will bring that right back to the surface of every lost person, and that is when tragedy touches them. And you know this to be true even in your own life. You know that when tragedy and difficult circumstances touch your life, where do your thoughts go? How have I sinned? Have I sinned? Is there some sin in my life that's causing it? Sometimes that may be the case. Most often it's not. But even among God's children, that's one of the things that comes first to mind. Remember Job's friends? They come to Job, and here he is sitting in sackcloth and ashes and boils all over him. You got to have sin somehow, Job, to bring this about. Because the human soul knows that. Knows that when from the hand of our Maker comes tragedy and loss and despair and disappointment, then the first place we think, the first place we look to, what sort of sin against our Maker has resulted in this? So she says, have you come to bring my sin back to remembrance? Look at Romans chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. When the Gentiles, the woman of course is a Gentile, who do not have the law, by nature they do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Before Elijah showed up, the woman knew in her heart that she had sinned against God. While their conscience also bears witness and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. She knows she's a sinner. And she also knows, look at her words again. You have come to bring my sin to remembrance. It's like she knows that her Maker sees right into her heart. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 12, how we're reminded of how God, through the exposing of His Word to our soul, it's like He's looking into our very soul. I get the sense that that's how she feels. She feels that this man Elijah, she's holding the body of her dead son, and she feels as though Elijah sees right into her heart and sees her very sin. So she says, what have you against me, O man of God? You come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. Verse 19. And he said to her, give me your son. I think perhaps the most helpful thing in that verse is not what Elijah says, but what he doesn't say. He's been falsely accused. His God has been falsely accused. God has been maligned. God has been scorned. God has been scandalized by claiming that God has evil intentions. Elijah has been scandalized by claiming that he had evil intentions and somehow brought about the death of her son and wanted to bring about the death of her son. Yet Elijah, first of all, makes no move to defend himself. It's very difficult to be accused, especially accused falsely, and to not come to your own defense. Of course, we think here of Jesus as He's accused falsely and does not open His mouth to come to His own defense. But Elijah as well does not even seek to defend himself. He instead is going to let God defend Himself, or let God defend him. That's a really hard thing to do. And I'm sure you recognize that, but let's just sort of flesh that out just a moment so that we can really kind of get our hands around the difficult temptation, the trial of faith, the test of faith that requires Elijah to keep his mouth closed in the face of accusations against God. We'll talk about that in a moment, but against himself here, against his own character here. Do you know how deeply in your heart is ingrained this need to defend yourself? It's automatic. You know, it's like the knee jerk. You go to the doctor and they hit the little hammer thing and your foot flies up and you're like, I had no control over that whatsoever. That's like our reaction when we are maligned, when we are scorned, accused, most especially when those accusations are false. Our need to protect our reputation is one of the strongest things in us, one of the strongest reactions in us. And one of the greatest tests of faith is cultivating the ability to not do that. At least not do that in every situation, and at least not do that first. Some of the things that God commands us aren't too difficult. Right? There's lots of things that God requires of us that are fairly easy to comply with. However, there are a handful of things that I think I would categorize as the hardest things of obedience that God asks of His people. Things like forgiving from your heart those who have sinned against you deeply. Or loving from your heart your enemy. And praying from your heart for the good of your enemy. Those things are hard. I would classify in that loving my wife like Christ loves the church. Hard. In that same category, I think, is keeping your mouth closed when evildoers accuse you of what you haven't done. And oftentimes, I think that God wants that of us and requires that of us. One of the reasons I think that is because His Word tells us richly how He delights to be our defender. Now, there's one thing that I've learned through my life experience that I think you'll find true in your life as well, and it's this. God will not compete with me to defend me. When I'm in need of defense, it's like if I step up to do that, God will just let me do it. God will come to my defense only if I let Him. He won't push me out of the way and say, shut up, get out of the way, let me do this for you. But instead, He waits for me to let Him do that. And when He does that, I assure you, He does a far better job than I do. And so that's one of the things that I've learned is that when I step out to defend myself, particularly against false accusations, that He will not come to my aid. But when I allow Him to take the lead in His time and in His way to defend me, He will do a far better job of defending me than I ever could. Elijah keeps his mouth closed. He doesn't come to his own defense. This is the furnace. The furnace, we're going to see in this passage, the temperature is getting turned up. It's not cooling down. This is not a cooling down, resting passage for Elijah. The furnace is being turned up, and one way that it's being turned up is because the widow is accusing Elijah of something that is far beneath his character, something he never would have dreamed of doing, and she's saying he did it. Now, I think another reason he's not coming to his defense, I think he's confused. Because not only is Elijah maligned, but also his God is maligned. So she accuses God of essentially of having evil intentions toward her, that somehow God has brought Elijah into her life just for the purpose of feeding her for about a year so he could kill her son. Not that that makes any sense, but again, she's extremely distraught, probably not thinking through this very well, but her heart sort of leaps out and takes the lead, and you've been there, I've been there, this sort of irrational, what is God doing? Is that He's blessed me in all these ways, but now He's brought this, so what has He just sort of brought me to this point so He could jerk the rug out from under my feet? I know you felt that because I felt that. You think back to how God has blessed you and cared for you, but then this tragedy has touched your life, and it's like in that moment, all the blessings of God were just a setup for Him to just come along and bring the hammer down. That's how she feels. Now, in response to this, Elijah also refrains from defending his God, which is another test of faith. Do you know how deep, how strong the temptation is for us not only to defend ourselves, but to defend our God? When our God is maligned, you can see this happen with a regular basis as you read the news and look at what people write and listen to what people say. Every time some sort of tragedy comes along, what comes along right on the heels is a whole chorus of people saying, oh, God's not evil, God's not bad, God didn't bring this about, God really does love people. It's like clockwork. 9/11, Katrina, the tsunami in Indonesia, the tsunami in Japan, all of those, the same thing. After that happens, there's sort of a chorus of voices that are writing blogs, that are writing articles, that are even writing books and saying, yeah, this was a great tragedy, but God's not bad. God's not a bad guy. Why is that? That's because we feel a deep need to defend our God. Why do we feel that need? There's two possible reasons. One is because we are deeply offended when the honor of our God is offended. That is good, that is holy, that is righteous. That is an evidence of a child of God. That when your father is offended, you feel indignation as well. But there's another reason that I think also sometimes comes to play, and that is this. When your God is offended, you're personally offended because you identify with Him. And so when someone criticizes your God or your religion, you take that personally. And you feel the need to vindicate it, not because you're offended that the name of your God was offended, but because you're offended personally. Now, those two motives are drastically different. One is holy, one is unholy. So the next time you find yourself in that position when a friend, an acquaintance, or you read some thing on Facebook in which God is offended and you sort of feel the hair on the back of your neck standing up, ask yourself, why? Why am I so offended? Why do I feel the need to vindicate God? Is it because His honor has been smeared? Or is it because my honor has been smeared? Elijah is in the test. God is testing him. He does not open his mouth to speak vindicative words about his God. He knows that his God will vindicate himself. But in addition to that, I think he's also confused himself. As we began the Elijah story, one of the things we noted was Elijah's knowledge of the Word of God. Remember from Deuteronomy 11, we mentioned it earlier. God says, if you will love me, if you will serve me, if you will not serve the false gods, I will bring water and dew to your land. If you won't, then I'll bring drought. So Elijah knows that passage, and this is what precipitates the whole drought thing, because he knows the Word of God, and he knows that God has declared, if you turn from me to the false gods, I will bring drought. So Elijah knows that passage, which was Deuteronomy chapter 11. Certainly he also knows passages like Genesis 15. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. Now wait a minute. The widow has blessed God's people. She has blessed the man of God. But seemingly, in return for that, God gives her not blessing, but curse. What happened to I'll bless those who bless you? What happened to, we just sang a few minutes ago, Psalm 23. What happened to surely goodness and mercy following me all the days of my life? That was written by David. David lived before Elijah. Elijah probably knows Psalm 23. And what does it mean for goodness and mercy to follow me? At the very minimum, it means that where Elijah goes, goodness and mercy go. So I think Elijah himself, this is a furnace. Elijah himself doesn't quite know what to say. But to his credit, to his great credit, notice what he doesn't say. Thank God he doesn't say, God has a good plan in this. Thank God that he doesn't say, heaven needed another angel. Thank God that he didn't say, God needed your son more than you need him. We trivialize the God of life and death when we make physical death into something as trivial as God needing another angel, as doctrinally unsound as that is. Elijah says the best thing he could say, which is nothing. He doesn't know. He doesn't know what God is doing here. He doesn't know the mind of God. He doesn't say to the widow, I am learned in the things of God. I've studied the Scriptures and I can tell you what God is now doing with this death of your son. Instead, all he does is take the woman's burden. The passage tells us that she's holding the boy in her arms, which tells us he's probably a small boy, small enough for the widow to hold. And all he does is just take her burden. He doesn't try to explain his God. He doesn't try to rationalize his God. Elijah has the strength of faith to risk his God being misunderstood. That takes a strength of faith to risk your God being misunderstood. How did Elijah come to such a strength of faith as that? At the brook. When he fought within his own heart about his own misunderstandings of God. God had brought him to the brook. The ravens were feeding him, but yet there was no water. What are you doing, God? He fought against the misunderstandings, and he saw in his own heart, God is bigger than that. He's bigger than my misunderstandings. I don't need to come to God's defense. He's far bigger than that. You know, I think oftentimes those who are quickest to come to God's defense do so because they have a low view of the Father. Their view of the Father is so low that they think He needs our defending of Him. Now again, that's not just to condemn all of that, because some of that is led by God and some of that is holy and righteous. But sometimes I think that we are quick to try to alleviate misunderstandings about God, because deep in our heart we're not really convinced that He's big enough and He's strong enough and He's powerful enough that He doesn't need our help explaining Him. Elijah's okay. He's okay with his God maybe being misunderstood. And remember where he is. He's in the middle of Baal country. What are the people going to think? Here's this widow. Everybody knows the widow has taken in a Yahweh prophet. What are they going to think? When this widow's woman's son dies, what's everybody in Zarephath going to think about Yahweh? Elijah is okay, leaving that up to God. This is a furnace, and God is continuing to refine His man.